I'm General Editor of the Journal of Management Studies, and today I'd like to talk to you about how to get past the editor's desk when you send a paper in to our journal. I'm going to start by sharing my slides with you, so I hope you'll forgive me for a bit of faffing about, not quite as slick as it would be if we were together in person. Okay, so the slides are slow to share, but here we are. I hope they're coming up for you now. Yeah, we should be on slide 1. So what I'm going to cover are who we are at JMS and what kinds of articles we publish, and in particular, what we look for in a paper and how to get past the editor's desk. I'll also cover common reasons for why a paper gets rejected and outcomes and what happens next. So who are we? JMS is a long-established journal. It was established in 1963, and it published then and still publishes innovative empirical and conceptual papers with the view of advancing knowledge and theory in a whole range of management and organisation studies fields. We get a lot of submissions, about 1,500 in 2020, and there are 3 of us general editors and a big team of associate editors, usually 9 or 10, internationally based. We're very fortunate to have a dedicated JMS editorial office, which is located in Durham and a team managed by Margaret Turner. We're ranked AJG 4 and FT Top 50. So I'm going to talk this morning about particular types of articles. We do have a whole range of papers that we publish, including things like point-counterpoint, but they're not the focus of this discussion. They tend to be more experienced colleagues who are writing these in conversation with other academics. The focus of this short talk is about regular articles, perhaps conceptual, perhaps empirical, that you might submit for a special issue, or just on an ad hoc basis for a general edition of the journal, and review articles, where you're looking to give an overview of a particular area of literature with implications for future research. When a paper comes into the journal, all papers will go to an editor who will read and consider all the papers and make an initial decision about what has potential to progress to review stage and what's going to be rejected from the editor's desk, i.e., it doesn't go out for review for another academic to look and comment on it. It's deemed not suitable at this early stage for JMS. What are we looking for when we go for this initial read of a paper? Well, we're hoping for papers that are unusual, surprising, maybe a bit quirky or challenging. We don't give any preference to a particular topic, method, or level of analysis. All approaches are welcome. We do look for papers that speak to our general JMS readership, and we're hoping for a strong theoretical orientation because that's who we are as a journal. So, what would be the handy tips for getting past the editorial desk? I think the first thing to suggest, it's really important to pay attention to the author guidelines and to actually read and be familiar with the journal. In terms of the author guidelines, really look at them closely and follow what they recommend. For example, we would anticipate that most of our papers would be around 12,000 words in length, maybe a little longer for something like a review. So if your paper is coming in at about 5,000 words, that suggests it's not quite the right fit for our journal. It's probably not dealing with the topic in sufficient depth. Make sure that you've really read the journal. Have others published in JMS on your topic area? If so, it's really important to engage with their papers. What did they say? How is yours different? How might what you say build on what's gone before in the journal? Make sure your paper delivers on its promises. Does it fulfill its aims? Often as an editor, I find that there is a mismatch between the aims at the front of the paper and the conclusions at the end. Somehow the paper has lost its way. So if you make a promise at the beginning of the paper, it's important that you follow that through and you do what it was that you said you were going to do at the beginning. It's also important for a journal like JMS to give a really thorough overview of the relevant literatures in your area and link your study to these. That's how you can explain to us how it's original, explain what there already is that exists in the field, and then talk about how your study might align with that, but where it might be different. What's new about what you're doing compared with what's already been written? It's really important to demonstrate methodological rigor. We need to know what your processes were. We need to know how you approached the ethical side of things. If you did interviews, we need to know how many people you talked to, how you selected them, perhaps where you interviewed them, how you analyzed your data, what methods you chose to analyze your data. JMS is aimed at a general management studies audience. I think one thing that's really key in getting past the editorial desk is to convince the editor that your arguments are really relevant for JMS's general readership. It doesn't really matter what your topic area is. It could be about refugees. It could be about a film crew. It could be about a dance company. What's really important is that somehow you make an argument for the notion that what you want to talk about is relevant to our general management readership. I once saw a review which I think captured this in essence, where the reviewer said something like, when I opened up this paper, I thought, what does this have to do with general management studies? But as I read the paper, I thought, oh, I'm convinced this has everything to do with management studies. That's the kind of thing we're looking for in a paper as we read it on the editor's desk. Ensure that your theoretical contribution is clear. It's not enough for a journal like JMS to make recommendations for practice, though that would be welcome. It's also important that you make a contribution to theory. How will people doing research in your area and more broadly think differently about their research having read your paper? And one way of ensuring that your theoretical contribution is clear would be to seek friendly reviews before you submit the paper. Get colleagues, supervisors, co-authors to read the paper and comment on it. Do they understand what your theoretical contribution is? Can they make any recommendations to you about how you might make that more clearly? If a paper is lively and interesting, it's more likely to make it through than one which is fairly competent but dull. This is something that you can also resolve through friendly reviews. Perhaps by getting somebody who's not immediately connected with your area to read the paper. Do they understand what you're talking about, even if they are not closely engaged with networks or signal theory or whatever it is that you are researching? Check your spelling and grammar. Editors don't feel able to send off a paper out for review if it's really badly presented, and that's very important, because it would be a pity to lose the chance of getting your paper onto the next stage just because it's poorly presented. But this does happen. So I read a paper the other day where actually the ideas were quite nice, but there were different typefaces, there were notes left in the margin, there was a bit where there was a cut and paste that hadn't worked. So the paper was just too messy for me to send it out. Having talked about what we look for in a paper, why might we reject a paper? Well, because it lacks a clear, significant, interesting contribution, going back to the idea of getting friendly reviews before you submit it. There might be a lack of methodological rigor. If, for example, I'm concerned about the ethics of the way that the research has been undertaken, I'd be looking for a section on ethics so that you explain how you went about it, and how, for example, you might have assured anonymity of your participants. Lack of a clear and appropriate theoretical framework. This goes back to allowing friends to read and comment on your paper before you send it in, so that it's really comprehensible, perhaps to somebody outside of your field, what you've done and how you are shedding new light on theory in your area and more broadly, in the general management studies field. Lack of clear implications for management practice. We need to know what the recommendations would be for practice and theory. But if you think that actually there are implications for management practice, then spell those out. How will things be different if people follow what you're doing in your paper? This can be something that gets picked up many months or years later. I was at my own topic areas about work family, and I was delighted to find that a US university had actually drawn upon one of my papers some years after it was published in terms of looking at post-maternity leave provision for women in the workplace. So the implications were there and they were drawn on. That's the kind of thing we're looking for in JMS. And most importantly, the lack of clear implication for management theory. That's a key component for a JMS paper. Really important, as mentioned, to demonstrate what you're doing, how it's different from what's gone before, and how scholars might think differently about their theoretical research, having read your paper and your contribution. Common reasons for rejection also include the fact that authors haven't read the guidelines and don't appear to have read JMS or know what it publishes. So there are no links within the paper to papers in JMS that have previously talked about the topic, or they're set out incorrectly, or they're very short, sharp papers, snappy photo shots of a scenario which are not in common with what we're publishing in JMS. I think for me, a very common reason why papers get rejected, even if they're interesting, is they don't link their research to management and organization theory. So there might be something that's very interesting, it's very narrow, the authors don't explain why it is relevant to management studies more broadly, and that means it's difficult to see how it would be of interest to the general readership of JMS. So the paper would get rejected at the editor's desk. Similarly, it's unclear why readers of JMS would be interested in the arguments made within the paper. And finally, as I was mentioning before, the really messy presentation of a paper means I don't feel able to send it to reviewers who would be expecting a nice clean copy that they can read without having to wade through messy comments, cut and paste that don't work, and very poor spelling and grammar. So having got your paper to the editor's desk, what are the potential outcomes? Well, one might be a desk reject. One thing I can promise is that you will get feedback from your editor to help you understand why the paper has been desk rejected. And that might support you in recrafting it and submitting it elsewhere. It might be worth saying that these stages are all very painful, but as academics, we do all understand what it feels like. I still get papers rejected, both at the desk stage and at revise and resubmit stage. But the feedback is what's really helpful to assist the writer, myself in some cases, in recrafting the paper so that when you submit it somewhere else, you've improved it and it's got more chance of getting through the process so that your voice may be heard. Sometimes you might get a paper that is rejected, but you are given the chance to resubmit this. Under our new Scholar One system, it might be that the paper is unsubmitted and you're asked to resubmit it. In these cases, the editor is not prepared to send your paper out for review in its present state, but they might invite you to revise and send the paper back for them to reconsider. And if that's the case, really look at what they've asked you to do. Try and follow their advice to the letter before you send it back in, and that will enhance the opportunity of the likelihood that your paper will be sent out for peer review, which is a good thing. If your paper is sent out for peer review, it's sent out to 2 or 3 peer reviewers, experts in your field. It will be anonymized, they won't know who you are, and they will read it, comment on it, and make recommendations to the editor about what happens next. Based on those recommendations, and also using their own judgment, the editor will take a decision about whether to reject the paper or to give you a chance to revise and resubmit it. I'm going to do a separate VT on how to manage an R&R, but this is good news. It means your paper is still in the system and you have a real chance of getting it published. I think these comments are relevant not only for JMS, but for any journal aiming for. I'm going to end just with a couple of slides, just so that you can see that where we're active on social media, and also to alert you to JMS Online, our blogging feature, which offers insights on the research that's published, and JMS Reflections, VTs like this, where we offer advice on how to get published in the journal, and indeed more generally in managing your research career. That's kind of all from me this morning. I really hope you find this useful. There will be a second VT on how to manage an R&R, and wishing you the very best of luck with your work. Thank you for listening.